Ron, thanks very much for joining us. As chair of the Senior Housing and Healthcare Association, obviously the pandemic has had a big effect over the year, both on the real estate side, but also on the sector more widely. I suppose, what's your take on 2021?
I would like to start indeed with sharing my appreciation to the sector, because 21 was, unprecedented times, both for care workers, but also for board members of senior homes and nursing facilities. But I think the good thing was that, at least from my perspective, it was a close cooperation between the operators, but also investors. So how can we deal with the situation? How can we cope with it? And that was also the positive thing to see this close harmony between the stakeholders. Yeah, and secondly, I'm really proud that I think the SHHA is growing to one of the most impactful associations of Europe. And of course, it's quite unique to have a multi-stakeholder platform with also cross-border activities. And it's really great added value to, speed up the maturity of the asset class, to gain insights, and also to create long-term partnerships.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see how this is developing, particularly for the sector more broadly. And in terms of 2022, Ron, I suppose, what do you see going forward?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very interesting outlook. From a real estate perspective, we do see a rising deal flow. And then it's both in terms of assets under management, but also explorations to emerging markets. And for example, the CEE, and it's gaining more interest, and I think that's very positive. After COP26, there was also full focus on decarbonization. And that's really, I'm really positive about it. And on one hand, it's really a big challenge because we have an enormous existing stock, which is most of the times quite outdated. So it will take a lot of capex to redevelop and upgrade it to the Paris Proof goals. But we do see, some effort to make it work, both from the operator perspective, but also the investor perspective. And it's really aligned with impact investing and ESG. And that's really one of the key topics for 22, because investors are really driven to make impacts, especially also on the the social side. And of course, healthcare, real estate, and senior housing ticks all the boxes for the S. I think one of the challenges is also to do some measurement and also valuation, because I think measurement on the environmental side, that's quite common now these days, but the S is still a challenge to make it very smart. Yeah, and maybe one additional comment on the outlook side, and that's more from the operational perspective. Yeah, well, the scarcity in personnel is really a tough one, because we do see that we need a lot of personnel in terms of the aging demographics, but also the rising costs is really one of the topics for our board members of the operations, and it's a hard one to tackle, and that's also where the operational perspective is actually fluid with the asset side, because we do need new concepts. And so we're trying to create a future-proof healthcare environment. And that's also in terms of empowering the aging demographics to live as long as possible at home, to create housing with care. It's also about integrated elderly communities. And of course, when you're suffering from dementia, for example, we should develop specialized facilities like nursing homes. To my opinion, really also a bit of a momentum to shift from an alternative asset class to my opinion, one of the most impactful main asset classes of the sector.
And Ron, in terms of the challenges for 2022 for the sector, what are you seeing there?
Yeah, so next to the personnel perspective, I think there's one must-have, and that's the analysis of the existing regulations, because we do see some transfers in terms of how can we empower people to live as long as possible at home, but it also takes some in-depth analysis of city development, and I think also for regulatory bodies, but also local governments, we should look more closely in terms of the cooperation. create more flexibility in terms of planning permissions. I think that's a very important one to speed up actually also the rising demand of affordability for elderly people. And that's really one of the biggest challenges of 22 and especially the next 5 years, to my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see the growth in terms of the sector. There's certainly the growth in terms of when looking at investor intentions of the capital wanting to deploy into this area, especially as you mentioned there with the social impact side as well. So it'll be interesting to see how both of those trends come together. Thanks very much for joining us, Ron.